April 1945. The small town of Würzburg lay in ruins, its medieval architecture reduced to skeletal frameworks of stone and ash. In the basement of what had once been St. Joseph's Hospital, 32-year-old nurse Margarete Hoffmann pressed a damp cloth against the forehead of a dying soldier. Her hands trembling not from fear of the artillery shells that occasionally shook dust from the ceiling, but from 3 days without sleep and the growing certainty that everything she had been taught to believe was crumbling as surely as the buildings above her. She had been told the enemy would show no mercy. She had been told that the American forces, and especially their colored troops, were savages who would brutalize German civilians and medical personnel alike. She had repeated these beliefs so often they had become as familiar as prayer, as unquestioned as the sunrise. She could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What would unfold over the next 72 hours would shatter Margaret's understanding of humanity, enemy and self, transforming a moment of hatred and fear into one of the most profound personal reckonings of her life. This is the story of how a single object, held in the hands of a man she had been taught to despise, would force her to confront the lies she had built her world upon, and how that confrontation would echo through the decades that followed. To understand Margarete Hoffmann's journey, we must first understand the world that shaped her. Born in 1913 in the Bavarian city of Würzburg, she grew up in a Germany still reeling from the aftermath of the First World War. Her father, a decorated veteran who had lost his left arm at Verdun, spoke often of German honor and the injustice of the Treaty of Versailles. Her mother, a devout Catholic, instilled in her a sense of duty and sacrifice that would later find expression in her nursing career. Margarete entered nursing school in 1931, just as the economic depression was reaching its peak. She witnessed families starving, veterans begging in the streets, and a nation searching desperately for answers. When the new regime came to power in 1933, it promised restoration of German pride and prosperity. Like millions of her countrymen, Margaret's family welcomed the change, seeing it as salvation from chaos. The propaganda that followed was relentless and pervasive. It seeped into every aspect of daily life, from the newspapers Margarete read over breakfast to the films she watched on rare evenings off from the hospital. It taught her to see the world in terms of hierarchy and threat, to believe that certain peoples were inherently superior while others were dangerous, subhuman, or both. The regime's messaging about people of African descent was particularly vicious, portraying them as primitive, violent, and incapable of civilization. These beliefs were reinforced in subtle and not-so-subtle ways throughout Margaret's professional training. Medical texts of the era included pseudoscientific theories about racial differences that have long since been thoroughly debunked. Instructors spoke casually about the supposed inferiority of non-European peoples. By the time Margarete completed her training and began working at St. Joseph's Hospital in 1935, these ideas had become woven into the fabric of her worldview, unexamined assumptions that she never thought to question. For nearly a decade, Margaret's life followed a predictable pattern. She worked long shifts at the hospital, attended Mass on Sundays, visited her aging parents on her days off, and occasionally walked along the main river with her younger sister, Liesel. She was known among her colleagues as hard-working and competent, though somewhat reserved. She had suitors over the years, but never married, telling herself that her work was her calling and that romance could wait. When the conflict began in 1939, Margarete initially experienced it as distant thunder, something happening far away that did not touch her daily reality. But as the years passed, the conflict came closer and closer to home. First came the rationing, then the air raid drills, then the steady stream of wounded soldiers filling the hospital's wards. By 1943, St. Joseph's had been converted almost entirely to military use, and Margarete found herself treating injuries she had never imagined in her training, the terrible wounds inflicted by modern weaponry. The bombing raid that devastated Würzburg came on March 16, 1945. In a single night, British bombers dropped hundreds of thousands of incendiary devices on the city, creating a firestorm that consumed 82% of the urban area. Over 5,000 civilians perished, and countless more were injured. Margaretta's parents were among the casualties, their apartment building reduced to rubble and flame. Her sister Liesel survived only because she had been visiting a friend in the countryside. The grief and trauma of that night hardened something inside Margarette. The enemy had become personal. She no longer saw the opposing forces as abstract combatants, but as murderers who had taken her parents, destroyed her city, and shattered her world. When word came that American ground forces were approaching Würzburg in early April, she felt not fear, but a cold, bitter hatred. She vowed to herself that she would never show these invaders an ounce of warmth or humanity, regardless of the cost. The Americans arrived in Würzburg on April 4, 1945. The city's defenders, a mixture of regular soldiers and hastily conscripted civilians, put up scattered resistance, but were quickly overwhelmed. By April 6th, the Stars and Stripes flew over the city hall, and American military police were patrolling the rubble-strewn streets. Among the first American units to enter the city was the 383rd Medical Collecting Company, a segregated unit composed entirely of African-American enlisted men under the command of white officers. This unit was part of the larger system of racial segregation that characterized the American military during the Second World War, a system that relegated black soldiers to support roles and denied them the recognition and opportunities afforded to their white counterparts. The 383rd had served with distinction throughout the European campaign, collecting wounded soldiers from forward positions and transporting them to field hospitals. They had operated under fire in France, Belgium, and Germany, saving thousands of lives while facing discrimination from both the enemy and their own military establishment. Now they were tasked with assisting in the care of both American wounded and German civilians and prisoners who required medical attention. Private First Class James Washington was a 26-year-old medic from Philadelphia who had joined the 383rd in 1943. The son of a Baptist minister and a school teacher, he had grown up in a household that emphasized education, faith, and service to others. He had wanted to become a doctor, but the racial barriers of 1930s America had made that dream nearly impossible. Instead, he had worked as an orderly at a Philadelphia hospital, learning what he could about medicine while saving money for a future that seemed perpetually out of reach. When he was drafted in 1942, James had hoped that military service might open new doors. He quickly learned otherwise. Basic training was segregated, facilities were segregated, and opportunities for advancement were almost non-existent for black soldiers. He was assigned to a medical unit not because of his experience and aptitude, but because support roles were where the military placed most African-American servicemen. Despite these obstacles, James excelled in his training and threw himself into his work with a dedication that earned the respect of his fellow soldiers. He studied medical texts in his spare time, practiced his skills at every opportunity, and developed a reputation as one of the most competent medics in the unit. His commanding officer, Captain William Hendricks, privately acknowledged that James had the knowledge and ability to be a physician, but would write in his reports that Private Washington performed his duties with exceptional skill and professionalism. James carried with him a small leather Bible that his mother had given him before he shipped overseas. Inside the front cover, she had inscribed a passage from the Gospel of Matthew, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." It was a verse that James had struggled with throughout his life, growing up black in an America that so often seemed determined to deny his humanity. How could one love those who hated you simply for the color of your skin? How could one pray for those who saw you as less than human? The conflict in Europe had deepened this struggle. James had seen the consequences of hatred taken to its ultimate extreme, had witnessed the liberation of a forced labor camp, where the skeletal survivors bore testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty. He had also experienced hatred from his own countrymen, the white American soldiers who refused to sit near him in the mess hall or who muttered slurs as he passed. And yet, his mother's words remained with him, challenging him to respond to hatred with something other than hatred in return. It was on the morning of April 7, 1945, that James Washington's path first crossed with Margaret Hoffman's. His unit had been ordered to assist at St. Joseph's Hospital, which was overwhelmed with casualties and desperately short of supplies. The hospital had been partially damaged in the March bombing and subsequent fighting, and its staff was working in conditions that were challenging beyond measure. James arrived at the hospital carrying a crate of medical supplies that had been allocated for distribution to civilian facilities. The crate contained bandages, sulfur powder, morphine, and other items that were worth their weight in gold in a city where medical resources had all but run out. He made his way down the stairs to the basement level, where he had been told the most critical patients were being housed. The basement was a scene from a nightmare. The air was thick with the smell of blood, infection, and unwashed bodies. Patients lay on cots, stretchers, and bare mattresses on the floor, many of them moaning in pain. The lighting was poor, powered by a generator that seemed on the verge of failing. Nurses and orderlies moved among the patients with expressions of exhausted determination, doing what they could with what little they had. Margaret was changing the dressing on a chest wound when she heard footsteps approaching. She looked up and froze. Standing before her was a black man in an American military uniform holding a crate marked with a red cross. For a moment, she simply stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Then the hatred and fear that had been building inside her for weeks came surging to the surface. She rose to her feet, her face contorting with disgust. "Don't touch me," she spat in German, then repeated the words in heavily accented English. "Don't touch me, get out, we don't want your kind here." Several of the other nurses looked up in shock. One of them, an older woman named Sister Bernadette, hurried over, her face a mask of embarrassment and concern. "Please," she said to James in halting English, "forgive her. She is tired, the bombing, her parents." But Margaret was not finished. She stepped toward James, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You think you can come here and pretend to be saviors?" she hissed. "You bombed our cities, you killed our people, and now you send this. This." She could not bring herself to say the word that was on the tip of her tongue, but her meaning was clear. James stood very still. He had experienced this kind of hatred before, more times than he could count. He had learned to absorb it, to let it wash over him without letting it penetrate too deeply. But that did not mean it did not hurt. Every time, it hurt. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were the groans of the patients and the distant rumble of vehicles in the streets above. Then, slowly, James lifted the lid of the crate and reached inside. When his hand emerged, it was holding a photograph. The photograph was small, no larger than a playing card, and its edges were worn from handling. It showed a woman in a nurse's uniform standing in front of a building that Margaret recognized immediately as St. Joseph's Hospital. The woman was smiling, one hand raised in a wave, the sun catching the silver crucifix at her throat. It was a photograph of Margaret herself, taken in the summer of 1938. "I found this," James said quietly, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "In the rubble of a building 2 streets from here, there was a suitcase blown open, clothes and papers everywhere. This was lying in the street. I thought someone might want it back." Margaret stared at the photograph, her mind reeling. She remembered when it had been taken, a beautiful June day when her sister Liesl had come to visit her at work. Liesl had just received a camera for her birthday and had insisted on taking Margaret his picture. They had laughed together afterward, walking to a cafe for coffee and cake. That suitcase, she realized, must have belonged to her parents. They had been packing to evacuate to Liesl's friend's house in the countryside when the bombing came. The suitcase would have been in their apartment, would have been blown into the street along with everything else when the building collapsed. Her father had probably packed that photograph himself, wanting to bring a picture of his daughter along to wherever they were going. Her father, who was gone now. Her mother, who was gone now. Their apartment, their possessions, their lives all gone. And here was this man. This man she had just treated with such venom, carefully returning a small piece of what had been lost. Margaret felt something crack inside her. It was not a dramatic breakdown, not a collapse into tears, but something quieter and perhaps more profound. It was the first fissure in a wall that she had been building for years, a wall constructed of propaganda and fear and unexamined assumptions. She reached out and took the photograph from James's hand, her fingers trembling. "Why?" she whispered in German. "Why would you do this?" James did not understand the words, but he understood the question. He had asked himself the same thing as he picked up the photograph from the rubble, as he carried it with him through the city, as he made inquiries to find out where it might have come from. Why bother? Why show kindness to people who would despise him? Why return a keepsake to those who saw him as subhuman? The answer, when it came to him, was the same answer he had been wrestling with his entire life. It was his mother's answer, his father's answer, the answer that had been instilled in him since childhood. "Because it's right," he said simply. "Because it's what I'd want someone to do for me." The moment hung between them, fragile and charged. Then Sister Bernadette stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Margaret's arm. "Come," she said softly. "There is work to do, and perhaps we could use the help." She looked at James and gestured toward the crate of supplies. "You bring medicine, yes? We need very much. Please come." James nodded and picked up the crate. As he followed Sister Bernadette deeper into the basement, he passed Margaret, who was still standing motionless. The photograph clutched to her chest. Their eyes met for just a moment. James saw in her face something he recognized, the look of a person whose world had just shifted on its axis. He had seen that look in the mirror more than once in his own life. The days that followed were among the most intense of Margaret's life. The hospital was overwhelmed, the staff was exhausted, and the influx of American medical personnel brought its own complications and tensions. But it also brought something that Margaret had not expected: relief. The Americans arrived with supplies that seemed almost magical in their abundance. Cases of bandages, bottles of plasma, vials of penicillin, the new wonder drug that could cure infections that would otherwise be fatal. They brought food, 2 rations that were plain but plentiful, a stark contrast to the near-starvation conditions that the hospital staff had been enduring. James Washington returned to the hospital every day that week, ferrying supplies, assisting with patients, and translating between the American medical officers and the German staff. He spoke no German, and his interactions with Margaret were limited to gestures, nods, and the occasional word of English that she understood. But she watched him, observed how he worked, and what she saw contradicted everything she had been taught. He was gentle with the patients, even the German soldiers who looked at him with suspicion or hostility. He was meticulous in his care, changing dressings with a precision that spoke of training and dedication. He was respectful to the German nurses, stepping aside in narrow corridors and offering assistance without condescension. When a young German corporal with a shattered leg screamed in pain during a procedure, it was James who held his hand and spoke soothingly until the worst had passed. Margaret found herself confused, unsettled. This was not the behavior of a savage or a subhuman. This was the behavior of a healer, a professional, a man of compassion. How could she reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been taught? On the 3rd day, she found herself working alongside James to treat a German civilian, an elderly woman who had been pulled from the rubble of her home with severe burns on her arms and torso. The woman was delirious with pain and kept calling out for her son, who had been killed in the fighting somewhere in the east. As they cleaned and dressed her wounds, Margaret saw that James's hands were as gentle with this German grandmother as they would have been with anyone. "You have done this before," Margaret said, her English halting but clear. "You have trained." James looked up, surprised to hear her address him directly. "Yes," he said. "I worked at a hospital before the conflict, in Philadelphia." "You were a doctor?" A shadow crossed James's face. "No," he said. "Not a doctor. I wanted to be. But—" He paused, searching for words that could explain a lifetime of barriers and disappointments. "It was not possible for me." Margaret nodded slowly. She understood about barriers, about paths that were closed off. She had seen friends whose ambitions had been crushed by circumstances beyond their control, by the rigid hierarchies and expectations of the society in which they lived. She had not imagined that such barriers existed in America, the land of supposed freedom and opportunity, but she was beginning to realize how much she did not know. "You are good," she said quietly, "at this work. You are good at it." James met her eyes. There was no warmth in her voice, not yet, but there was something else. A grudging acknowledgement that was perhaps more valuable because it was so hard won. "Thank you," he said. They returned to their work in silence, but something had shifted between them. The wall was cracking further. That evening, after her shift ended, Margaret sat alone in a small room that had once been a storage closet and was now her sleeping quarters. She held the photograph that James had returned to her, studying the image of her younger self with a strange sense of distance. Who was that woman, smiling so confidently in front of the hospital? What had she believed? What had she hoped for? What had she imagined her future would hold? She thought about her parents, about the last time she had seen them. It had been a Sunday dinner, 2 days before the bombing. Her father had been quieter than usual, her mother more anxious. They had listened to the radio reports together, heard about the advancing enemy forces, talked about whether it was time to leave the city. Margaret had urged them to go, to get out while they could. Her father had shaken his head. "This is our home," he had said. "We have lived here all our lives. I will not be driven out by fear." 2 days later they were gone. Margaret wept then for the first time since the bombing. She wept for her parents, for her city, for the world that had been destroyed. But she also wept for something else, something harder to name. She wept for the person she had become, for the hatred that had taken root in her heart, for the way she had treated James Washington on that first day. She wept for the lies she had believed and the truth she was only beginning to glimpse. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she sat with the photograph in her hands and asked herself questions she had never dared to ask before. How much of what she believed was actually true? How much was propaganda, fear, ignorance? If she had been so wrong about one man, how many others had she misjudged? How much cruelty had been done in the name of beliefs that were built on nothing but lies? The questions were painful, but she did not turn away from them. She understood on some level that this was a reckoning that had been waiting for her, perhaps for years, and she understood that turning away from it would be a betrayal of everything that had happened, of her parents' deaths, of James's kindness, of her own capacity for something better than hatred. The following days brought more revelations. As the American forces consolidated their control over Würzburg and the surrounding region, information began to emerge about the full scope of what the German regime had done. Rumors that Margaret had dismissed as enemy propaganda were confirmed by eyewitness accounts, by documents, by the testimony of soldiers who had seen the camps and the horrors within them. Sister Bernadette, who had connections to the Catholic resistance networks that had operated in secret throughout the conflict, shared what she knew with Margaret in hushed conversations after hours. She spoke of the millions who had been murdered, the systematic extermination of Jewish people, Roma, disabled persons, and others deemed undesirable. She spoke of the medical experiments, the forced labor, the gas chambers. She spoke of the children. Margaret listened in growing horror. She had not known, not really. She had heard whispers, had suspected that terrible things were being done, but she had never allowed herself to confront the full reality. It had been easier to look away, to focus on her work, to tell herself that she was just a nurse doing her job. But that excuse seemed hollow now, a coward's refuge. How could she not have known when the evidence had been all around her? How could she not have seen? She thought about James Washington again. She thought about the hatred she had felt toward him, the disgust with which she had treated him, and she realized that this hatred was of a piece with the larger evil that had consumed her country. It was all connected, the propaganda and the prejudice, the lies about racial hierarchy and the atrocities that those lies had enabled. She had been a small part of a vast machinery of hatred, and even though she had not pulled any triggers or operated any chambers, she had contributed through her silence, her acceptance, her refusal to question. This realization was almost more than she could bear. She considered briefly ending her own life. The thought came to her in the darkness of her storage closet room, a whisper of escape from the weight of what she was confronting. But she rejected it. That would be another form of cowardice, another turning away. If she was to make any meaning out of what had happened, she had to face it. She had to live with it. She had to find a way forward. She began by apologizing to James. It happened on the 5th day after their first encounter. They were both in the basement of the hospital. attending to a ward of patients who were recovering from surgeries. Margaret approached James during a quiet moment and asked if they could speak privately. He looked surprised, but nodded, and they stepped into a corridor where they would not be overheard. Margaret took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding and her mouth was dry. She had prepared words in English, rehearsed them in her mind, but now they seemed inadequate. "I must say something to you," she began. "About the first day, what I said to you, how I treated you." James's expression was unreadable. "Go on," he said. "It was wrong, all of it. The things I said, the way I looked at you, it was wrong and I am sorry." She paused, struggling to find the right words. I was told many things about people like you. Terrible things. I believed them because I did not know better, because I did not want to know better. But I see now that they were lies. All lies." She looked down at her hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I know that sorry is not enough. I know that words cannot undo what was done, what was said. But I need to say it anyway. I need you to know that I see now. I see that I was wrong." There was a long silence. When Margaret finally looked up, she saw that James was studying her with an expression she could not quite interpret. It was not anger, but it was not forgiveness either. It was something more complex, layered with the weight of experiences she could only dimly imagine. "I appreciate you saying that," James said finally. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Most people never do." "It is not courage," Margaret said bitterly. "It is shame. It is seeing myself clearly for the first time and hating what I see." James shook his head. "No," he said. "Shame without action is just self-pity. What matters is what you do next, who you choose to be going forward." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather Bible that his mother had given him. He held it for a moment, running his thumb over the worn cover, then opened it to the inscription in the front. "My mother wrote this before I shipped out," he said. "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. I've struggled with that my whole life. How do you love people who hate you for something you can't control? How do you pray for people who see you as less than human?" He looked at Margaret, and she saw in his eyes a depth of pain and resilience that took her breath away. "I don't have all the answers," he continued, "but I know that hate is a poison. It destroys the person who carries it as much as the person it's directed at. And I know that people can change, they can see their mistakes and choose different. That's what gives me hope." He closed the Bible and returned it to his pocket. "You apologized to me, and I accept your apology, but the real work isn't about me. It's about you. It's about what kind of person you're going to be from now on." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I will try. I will try to be different." "That's all any of us can do," James said, and then, unexpectedly, he extended his hand. Margaret looked at the offered hand, this hand that she had recoiled from just days before. Slowly, she reached out and took it. His grip was firm and warm, and in that simple human contact, she felt something begin to heal. Over the next few weeks, Margaret threw herself into her work with a new sense of purpose. The hospital was still overwhelmed. The city was still in ruins, and there was more than enough suffering to go around. But she approached her duties with a different spirit now, not merely going through the motions, but actively seeking to connect with her patients as human beings, regardless of their nationality or background. She found herself working more and more often alongside James and the other members of the 383rd. She learned their names, listened to their stories, asked questions about their lives back in America. She discovered that James had 2 younger sisters whom he missed terribly, and that he sent most of his pay home to his mother. She learned that Corporal Elijah Turner was a talented artist who sketched portraits of his fellow soldiers in his spare time, and that Sergeant Michael Robinson had been a high school teacher before the conflict and hoped to return to education when it was over. She also learned about the discrimination they faced, both from the enemy forces and from their own military. She heard about the segregated facilities, the insults and slurs, the constant message that they were somehow less than their white counterparts despite performing the same duties and facing the same dangers. She learned about the double consciousness that James had described, the experience of being American while being treated as something less than American, of fighting for a country that did not fully recognize their humanity. These conversations were uncomfortable, challenging. They forced Margareta to confront not only the lies she had been taught about other races, but also the broader systems of prejudice and oppression that existed throughout the world, including in countries she had imagined to be beacons of freedom. She began to understand that the hatred she had absorbed was not unique to her country, but was part of a larger human failing, a tendency to dehumanize and dominate that manifested in different ways in different places. But the conversations were also illuminating, even inspiring. She saw in James and his comrades a resilience and dignity that humbled her. Despite everything they had endured, they had not given in to bitterness or despair. They continued to do their jobs with professionalism and compassion. They continued to hope for a better future. They continued to see the humanity in others, even in those who refused to see the humanity in them. Margaret wanted to learn from that. She wanted to understand how they did it. One evening, she asked James directly. They were sitting on an overturned crate outside the hospital, taking a brief rest after a long day. The sun was setting over the ruins of Würzburg, painting the broken skyline in shades of orange and pink. "How do you not hate us?" Margareta asked. "After everything that was done to you, how do you still treat us with kindness?" James was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "It's not that I never feel anger," he said finally. "I do, I feel it a lot. When someone looks at me like I'm dirt, when I'm reminded that half my country thinks I'm less than human, yeah, I get angry." He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. "But I made a choice a long time ago that I wasn't going to let that anger define me, because if I let it take over, then they win. Then I become what they say I am, and I refuse to do that." He tossed the stone into the rubble. "My father used to say that the measure of a man isn't how he treats people who can do something for him. It's how he treats people who can't. How he treats people who are vulnerable or different or even hostile. That's the real test of character." He looked at Margaret. "You ask me how I don't hate you. The truth is I don't know you well enough to hate you or love you or anything else. I know what you did on that first day, and I know what you're doing now. And I know that people are complicated. They can do terrible things and good things sometimes in the same day. What matters is the direction they're moving in." Margaret absorbed this in silence. It was a more generous philosophy than she felt she deserved, but she recognized the wisdom in it. People were complicated. She was complicated. The question was not whether she had done wrong in the past, but whether she could do better in the future. "I want to move in a different direction," she said. "I want to be someone who helps rather than hurts. But I don't know how. Everything I believed has fallen apart. I don't know what to build in its place." James nodded slowly. "That's honest," he said. "And I think that's where you have to start. You can't build something new until you've cleared away the rubble of the old. Maybe that's what this time is for, just clearing rubble. The building comes later." It was not a complete answer, but it was a place to begin. As the weeks turned into months, the situation in Würzburg gradually stabilized. The immediate crisis passed, essential services were restored, and life began to assume something resembling normalcy, or at least a new normal. The hospital continued to operate, treating patients from both the civilian population and the various military forces that were now occupying the region. Margaret's relationship with James deepened into something that might be called friendship, though it was a friendship complicated by history, circumstance, and the vast differences in their experiences. They continued to work together, to talk during quiet moments, to share meals from their respective rations. She taught him a few words of German, he taught her some American slang. They discovered shared interests in music and literature, debated the merits of different approaches to medical care, and occasionally even laughed together. But there were limits to how close they could become. The American military strictly forbade fraternization between soldiers and German civilians, and the social taboos against interracial relationships were even more severe. Margaret and James were careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, to interact only in professional contexts, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. They both understood that any closer connection would bring trouble down on both their heads. There was also the matter of what they did not discuss. Margaret knew that her apology had been accepted, but she also knew that acceptance was not the same as resolution. There were wounds that could not be healed by a few weeks of better behavior, injustices that could not be balanced by individual acts of kindness. James never spoke of it directly, but she could see in his eyes sometimes a wariness, a reserve, a guardedness that reminded her that trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. She tried to respect that. She did not press for more intimacy than he was willing to give. She focused on demonstrating through her actions that she was committed to change, that her apology had not been empty words. She hoped that, with time, the guardedness would fade and something more genuine could take its place. But she also understood that this might never happen, and she tried to make peace with that possibility. In May, Germany officially surrendered, and the conflict in Europe came to an end. The news brought celebration among the American forces and a complicated mix of emotions among the German population. For many, there was relief that the fighting was finally over, fear about what the future would hold, and a growing awareness of the full scope of what their country had done. The trials of the major leaders of the defeated regime would soon begin, and the process of confronting the past was just getting started. For Margaret, the end of the conflict brought a personal crisis. The American occupation forces were reorganizing their medical operations, and the 383rd Medical Collecting Company received orders to redeploy. James would be leaving Würzburg within a few weeks. Margareta tried to prepare herself for his departure. She told herself that it was inevitable, that their time together had always been temporary, that she should be grateful for what she had learned and not mourn what she was losing. But the thought of his absence left a hollow ache in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. On one of his last days in the city, James came to the hospital with a small package wrapped in brown paper. He found Margaret in the supply room, taking inventory, and handed her the package without ceremony. "What is this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside the paper was a book, an English-German dictionary, well used but in good condition. On the inside cover, James had written an inscription in his careful handwriting. "For Margaret, may you always find the right words. With respect, James Washington." Margaret looked at the book, then at James, and felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," James replied. "I just thought, if you're going to build something new, it helps to have the tools, and language is one of the best tools there is." She clutched the dictionary to her chest, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I will treasure this," she said. "Always." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of impending separation hanging between them. There was so much Margaret wanted to say, so many things she wished she could express, but the words tangled in her throat, inadequate to the complexity of what she felt. Finally, James spoke. "I don't know what's going to happen next," he said. "For you, for me, for any of us. The world is changing, and I don't think anyone knows what it's going to look like when the dust settles. But I believe that things can get better. I have to believe that, and I believe that you can be part of making them better." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Take care of yourself, Nurse Hoffman," James said, and then, with a small smile, "and keep practicing your English." She tried to return the smile, though it felt fragile on her face. "Take care of yourself, Private Washington, and thank you for everything." He nodded once, then turned and walked away. Margaret watched him go until he disappeared around the corner, and then she stood alone in the supply room for a long time, holding the dictionary in her hands and wondering what would come next. The months following James's departure were a period of profound transformation for Margaret. The immediate tasks of survival and recovery gave way to longer-term questions about meaning, purpose, and identity. Who was she now that the beliefs she had built her life around had crumbled to dust? What did she want to become? How could she contribute to a better world? She began by educating herself. Using the dictionary James had given her, she worked to improve her English, reading whatever American books and magazines she could find among the occupation forces. She read about American history, about the struggles for civil rights, about the gap between the country's ideals of equality and its reality of discrimination. She began to understand that the hatred she had been taught was not unique to her country, but was part of a global pattern of oppression that took different forms in different places. She also read about her own country's past, truly read about it for the first time, not the sanitized version she had learned in school, but the full, terrible truth. She learned about the systematic murder of millions, the camps, the death marches, the medical experiments. She learned names and numbers and dates, each one a weight added to her conscience. She did not turn away from this knowledge, though it made her physically ill at times. She understood that confronting the past was necessary if she was ever to move beyond it. Sister Bernadette became a mentor and friend during this period. The older nun had been involved with Catholic resistance networks during the conflict and had sheltered several Jewish families in the hospital's basement at great personal risk. She guided Margaret's spiritual questioning with patience and wisdom, helping her to distinguish between the faith she had been raised with and the distortions of that faith that the regime had promoted. "We are all sinners," Sister Bernadette told her one evening. "Every one of us falls short of what we should be. But God's grace is greater than our sin. What matters is that we repent, that we turn away from evil, and that we dedicate ourselves to doing good. You cannot change what you did in the past, Margaret, but you can change what you do from this day forward." Margaret took these words to heart. She could not undo the hatred she had harbored, could not unsay the words she had spoken to James on that first day. But she could choose to live differently. She could choose to treat every person she encountered with dignity and respect. She could choose to speak out against prejudice when she saw it. She could choose to be, in her small way, a force for healing rather than harm. She began putting this commitment into action in concrete ways. When the hospital treated displaced persons from Eastern Europe, who were often looked down upon by the local population, Margaret made a point of caring for them with the same attentiveness she gave to German patients. When colleagues made disparaging remarks about the occupation forces, she pushed back, reminding them that they were all human beings deserving of respect. When a new nurse joined the staff and expressed views about racial hierarchy that echoed what Margaret herself had once believed, she took the young woman aside and shared her own story of transformation, hoping to plant a seed of doubt. These actions were small, perhaps insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but Margaret believed that they mattered. She believed that every act of kindness, every challenge to prejudice, every choice to see another person's humanity contributed to a better world, even if the contribution was too small to measure. And she believed that the sum of these small acts, multiplied across countless individuals making similar choices, could eventually add up to real and lasting change. She thought about James often during this time. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he had made it home safely to Philadelphia. She wondered if he thought about her, if he remembered the German nurse who had spat hatred at him and then apologized, or if she had faded from his mind among all the other experiences of the conflict. She hoped that he was well, that he was pursuing his dream of becoming a doctor, that he was finding happiness in a world that had given him so many reasons for despair. She did not expect to hear from him again. The gulf between their worlds was too vast, the barriers too high. Their time together had been a brief intersection of paths that were now diverging toward separate horizons. She treasured the memory of their conversations, the lessons she had learned from him, the dictionary that sat on her nightstand and that she read from every day. But she did not imagine that their story would have any further chapters. She was wrong. The letter arrived in October 1946, more than a year after James had left Würzburg. It came through military post, forwarded from the hospital to Margaret's new address, a small apartment in a partially rebuilt section of the city. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately, and her hands trembled as she tore it open. "Dear Nurse Hoffman," the letter began, "I hope this finds you well. I have thought about you often since I left Germany and have wondered how you are faring. I apologize for not writing sooner. The return home was more difficult than I expected, and it has taken me some time to find my footing. I am back in Philadelphia now, living with my mother and sisters. I have returned to work at the hospital where I was before the conflict, but in a new position." The hospital has started a program to train colored men as physicians, one of the first programs of its kind in the country. I have been accepted and will begin my studies next month. It is what I have wanted my whole life, and I can scarcely believe it is finally happening. I have been thinking about what we discussed during those weeks in Würzburg, about hatred and change, and the direction people are moving in. I want you to know that I believe you are moving in the right direction. I could see it in the way you worked, in the questions you asked, in the way you treated people. I know that the road ahead of you is not easy, that confronting what your country did will be painful, and that building something new from the rubble will take time. But I have faith that you will persevere. I also want to thank you. Thank you for your apology, which I know was not easy to make. Thank you for listening to me and trying to understand. Thank you for reminding me that people can change, even people who have believed terrible things. In a world that often seems bent on confirming the worst about humanity, it is good to be reminded of the capacity for growth. I do not know if we will ever see each other again. The world is a big place, and our paths have led us very far apart. But I want you to know that I will remember you, and that I wish you well. May you find the peace and purpose you are seeking. With respect, James Washington. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she sat down at her small table and began to write a reply. Their correspondence continued over the following years, letters crossing the Atlantic every few months. James wrote about his medical studies, the challenges and triumphs of training to become a physician in a system still rife with discrimination. Margaret wrote about her work at the hospital, her ongoing education, her efforts to contribute to the rebuilding of her city and her country. They wrote about the larger events of the world as well, the onset of the Cold War, the partition of Germany, the slow and halting progress towards civil rights in America. They shared their hopes and fears, their moments of despair and their stubborn commitment to believing that things could get better. Their letters became a lifeline for both of them, a connection to someone who understood what they were trying to do and why it mattered. In 1950, James graduated from medical school and became one of the first black physicians to be certified in Pennsylvania. He sent Margaret a photograph of himself in his white coat, standing in front of the hospital where he had once worked as an orderly. She framed it and placed it on her dresser, next to the photograph of herself that he had returned to her all those years ago. In 1952, Margaret enrolled in a program to become a nursing instructor, determined to pass on what she had learned to a new generation. She developed a curriculum that emphasized not just technical skills, but also ethics, compassion, and the importance of treating every patient as a full human being. She told her students about her own journey, about the lies she had believed and the truth she had discovered, about the black American medic who had shown her kindness when she deserved none. Some of her students were skeptical, resistant. They had been raised with the same propaganda Margaret had absorbed, and they did not want to hear that it was wrong. But others listened, thought about what she was saying, and began their own journeys of questioning and growth. Margaret could not know what seeds she was planting, could not measure the impact of her teaching, but she believed, as she had learned to believe, that small acts could add up to something larger. In 1955, James wrote to tell her that he was getting married. His bride was a nurse named Dorothy, whom he had met at the hospital, a woman of grace and intelligence who shared his values and his faith. He invited Margaret to attend the wedding, knowing that it was almost certainly impossible, but wanting her to know that she would be welcome. Margaret could not attend, the logistics and expense of transatlantic travel being far beyond her means, but she sent a gift, a set of fine German porcelain that had belonged to her mother, one of the few family heirlooms to survive the bombing of Würzburg. She included a letter wishing James and Dorothy a lifetime of happiness and expressing her hope that she might one day have the chance to meet his wife in person. James's reply included a photograph of the wedding and a promise that they would find a way to meet again someday. The years continued to pass. James built a successful medical practice in Philadelphia, specializing in pediatric care and serving a largely black community that had few other options for quality healthcare. He became an advocate for civil rights, participating in marches and voter registration drives and lending his voice to the growing movement for equality. He and Dorothy had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, whom they raised to believe in justice, compassion, and the possibility of change. Margaret remained at St. Joseph's Hospital, rising to become the head of nursing education. She trained hundreds of nurses over the years, instilling in them the values she had learned through her own painful transformation. She never married, but she found deep fulfillment in her work, her friendships, and her ongoing correspondence with James. She became known throughout Würzburg as a woman of integrity and kindness, a reputation that meant more to her than any accolade. She also became involved in efforts to reckon with her country's past. She participated in reconciliation initiatives, spoke at memorial events, and supported the education of young people about what had happened and why it should never be allowed to happen again. These were difficult engagements, stirring up memories and emotions that she would have preferred to leave buried. But she understood that true healing required confronting the wounds, not hiding them, and she believed that her own story of transformation could help others find their way to a similar change. The meeting that James had promised finally came in the summer of 1963. He was attending a medical conference in Frankfurt and arranged to travel to Würzburg for a visit. Margaret took time off from work, cleaned her apartment obsessively, and spent an anxious night unable to sleep as she waited for his arrival. When he knocked on her door the next morning, she opened it to find a man she almost did not recognize. James was 44 years old now, his hair showing the first touches of grey, his face lined with the cares and triumphs of nearly 2 decades of living. But his eyes were the same, warm and thoughtful and full of a quiet strength that had not diminished with time. "Nurse Hoffman," he said, with a smile that took her back 18 years. "Dr. Washington," she replied, and then they were embracing, holding each other in the doorway as tears streamed down both their faces. They spent 2 days together, walking through the rebuilt streets of Würzburg, visiting the hospital where they had worked, sitting in cafes and talking for hours. They spoke of the past, the intervening years, the people they had become. They spoke of their hopes for the future, for their respective countries, for a world that still had so far to go, but that had also come so far from the ruins of 1945. On the last evening, they returned to a spot near the hospital where they had once sat watching the sunset over the ruined city. The view was different now, the skyline rebuilt and new, but the colors of the sky were the same, orange and pink and gold. "Do you remember what you told me?" Margaret asked. "About the direction people are moving in?" James nodded. "I remember. I have thought about that so often over the years. It has guided me. It has kept me going when I wanted to give up." She turned to look at him. "I want you to know that you saved me, James, not just on that first day when you showed me kindness I did not deserve, but every day since. You saved me from becoming someone I would have despised. You showed me that change was possible, and you believed in me when I did not believe in myself." James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You give me too much credit," he said. "You did the work. You made the choice to change. I just showed you that the choice existed." "That was everything," Margaret said. "That was everything." They sat in silence as the sun sank below the horizon, 2 people from different worlds who had found each other in the ruins and had helped each other build something new. The years that followed brought both joy and sorrow. In 1968, James wrote to Margaret with the news that his mother had passed away. She had lived long enough to see her son become a doctor, to meet her grandchildren, to witness the passage of the Civil Rights Act that finally, officially, granted Black Americans the equal rights they had always deserved. She had died peacefully, surrounded by family, and James found comfort in knowing that she had seen her prayers answered. Margaret's sister Liesel passed away in 1971 after a long illness. She was the last of Margaret's immediate family, and her death left Margaret feeling untethered, adrift. James's letters during this period were a source of great comfort, reminders that she was not alone, that there were people in the world who cared about her and wished her well. In 1975, Margaret retired from her position at the hospital. She was 62 years old, and her health was beginning to fail. She had given everything she had to her work, and now it was time to rest. Her colleagues threw her a retirement party, presented her with gifts and accolades, and told stories about how she had touched their lives. Many of them wept. Margaret wept too. She spent her retirement years quietly, reading, gardening, and maintaining her correspondence with James. They had now been writing to each other for 30 years, a friendship that had spanned decades and continents, and that had become one of the most important relationships in either of their lives. Margaret reread their old letters sometimes, marveling at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. In 1980, James and Dorothy visited Germany again, this time with their 3 adult children. Margaret hosted them all in her small apartment, cooking traditional German dishes and telling stories about their father's time in Würzburg. The children had heard the story before, of course, many times. But hearing it from Margaret herself, seeing the photograph of their father as a young soldier that still sat on her dresser, made it real in a way it had not been before. "My father always said you were one of the bravest people he ever met," James's daughter Evelyn told Margaret. "He said that admitting you were wrong and changing your whole life because of it took more courage than anything he saw during the conflict." Margareta shook her head. "Your father is the brave one," she said. "He had every reason to hate me, and he chose compassion instead. He had every reason to give up on his dreams, and he persevered. He is the one who showed me what courage looks like." The visit was brief, only a few days, but it was a gift that Margaret treasured for the rest of her life. In 1985, James suffered a heart attack. He survived, but it was a warning, a reminder that time was not unlimited. He began to slow down, cutting back his practice and spending more time with his family. His letters to Margaret became shorter, written in a shakier hand, but they continued to come, regular as the seasons. In 1988, Margaret was diagnosed with cancer. The disease had spread before it was detected, and the doctors told her that there was nothing to be done. She had perhaps a year, perhaps less. She wrote to James immediately, telling him the news with her characteristic directness. "I am not afraid," she wrote. "I have had a good life, a meaningful life, and I am ready. But I wanted you to know so that we can use whatever time we have left to say the things that need to be said." James's reply came by return post, urgent and full of emotion. "I am coming to see you," he wrote. "Dorothy and I will fly over as soon as we can arrange it. Please hold on, Margaret. I need to see you one more time." They arrived in Würzburg in October, as the leaves were turning and the air was growing crisp. Margaret met them at the train station, thinner than they remembered and walking with a cane, but with her eyes still bright and her spirit undiminished. They embraced on the platform, holding each other tightly, aware that this might be the last time. The days that followed were bittersweet, full of memories and laughter and tears. They talked about everything and nothing, the big events of their lives and the small details that somehow mattered just as much. They looked through old photographs, including the one of Margaret in front of the hospital that had started it all. They took walks in the autumn sunshine, moving slowly, savoring each moment. On the last evening before James and Dorothy were to return to America, Margaret asked James to help her with something. She led him to a small desk in her apartment and opened a drawer, revealing a thick bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. "These are all of your letters," she said. "Every one you have sent me over 43 years. I want you to have them back." James was moved almost beyond words. "Margaret, I don't know what to say." "Say that you will remember me," she said. "Say that when I am gone, you will think of me sometimes and know that I was grateful. Grateful for your kindness, your friendship, your faith in me. Grateful for the life I was able to live because of what you taught me." "I will remember you," James said, his voice breaking. "I will remember you every day. You are part of me, Margaret, part of who I am and who I've tried to be. You showed me that people can change, that forgiveness is possible, that there is always hope. I will carry that with me for the rest of my life." They embraced then, holding each other as they had held each other on that first day of reunion in 1963, when they had been younger and the future had seemed long. But this embrace was different. This embrace was a farewell. Margaret passed away in February of 1989. She died peacefully in her own bed, with a nurse from St. Joseph's sitting beside her. She was 75 years old. James received the news by telegram. He wept when he read it, wept for the loss of his dear friend, wept for the end of a connection that had sustained him through so many years. He thought about what Margaret had meant to him, the transformation she had undergone, the example she had set. He thought about the frightened, hateful woman who had spat at him in that basement, and the brave, compassionate woman who had spent the rest of her life trying to make amends. He thought about her last words to him, the request that he remember her, and he knew that he would honor that request for as long as he lived. He asked his daughter Evelyn to write a eulogy for Margaret's memorial service, and he sent it to be read aloud by one of the nurses who had trained under her. The eulogy spoke of redemption, of the possibility of change, of the courage it takes to confront one's own failures and choose a different path. It spoke of the friendship between a black American medic and a German nurse who had once despised him, and of the hope that this unlikely bond represented for a world still learning to overcome its divisions. The eulogy ended with words that James himself had written, words that he asked to be inscribed on Margaret's tombstone. She had the courage to change. She had the grace to forgive herself. She had the compassion to spend her life helping others. May we all aspire to such a journey. James lived for another 12 years after Margaret's death. He continued to practice medicine on a reduced schedule, continued to advocate for justice and equality, continued to tell the story of his time in Germany and the nurse who had taught him so much about the human capacity for transformation. He told the story to his children and grandchildren, to medical students and civil rights activists, to anyone who would listen. He believed that it was a story that needed to be told, that its lessons were needed now more than ever. He passed away in 2001 at the age of 82. Dorothy was at his side, holding his hand, as she had held it through 51 years of marriage. His last words were of love, for his family, for his work, for the life he had been blessed to live. And there at the end he thought of Margaret, and he hoped that he would see her again, wherever they were going next. The legacy of James Washington and Margaretha Hoffman lived on in the generations that followed. James's daughter Evelyn became a civil rights attorney, dedicating her career to fighting for justice in the courts. His son, Michael, became a physician like his father, serving underserved communities in rural Pennsylvania. His youngest, David, became a teacher, instilling in his students the values of compassion and critical thinking that his father had embodied. In Würzburg, a small memorial was established at St. Joseph's Hospital in Margaret's honor. It consists of a plaque on the wall of the basement where she once worked, telling the story of her transformation and her decades of service. Nursing students at the hospital still learn about her as part of their training, still hear the story of the black American medic who returned a photograph and changed a life. The photograph itself, the small picture of Margaret smiling in front of the hospital in 1938, is now in the possession of James's family. Evelyn keeps it in a frame on her mantelpiece, next to a photograph of her father in his white coat on the day he graduated from medical school. She looks at these images sometimes and thinks about what they represent: the possibility of change, the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of hatred and despair. The world that James and Margaret lived through was a world torn apart by hatred, prejudice, and violence. The ideology that Margaret absorbed as a young woman led to the murder of millions, to suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. The discrimination that James faced throughout his life was part of a system of oppression that denied basic dignity and opportunity to generations of people based on the color of their skin. These were not problems that could be solved by individual acts of kindness, by one person changing their mind or another person choosing compassion. They required collective action, institutional change, the slow and painful work of dismantling systems of injustice that had been built up over centuries. James and Margaret both understood this, and they both contributed to this larger struggle in their own ways, through their work, their advocacy, their teaching, their example. But they also understood that the larger struggle was made up of countless individual choices, moments when people decided who they were going to be and how they were going to treat others. Every time someone chose kindness over cruelty, understanding over hatred, growth over stagnation, they were contributing to a better world. Every time someone had the courage to confront their own prejudices and change their behavior, They were proving that transformation was possible and inspiring others to do the same. This was the lesson that James carried with him from his mother's Bible, the lesson he tried to live by even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, not because they deserve it, not because it will be easy, but because it is the only way to break the cycle of hatred, the only way to create something better than what came before. And this was the lesson that Margaret learned in that hospital basement in April 1945. When a man she had been taught to despise held out a photograph and changed her life. People can change. Direction matters. What you do next is what defines you. She spent the rest of her life trying to live by that lesson, trying to be worthy of the faith that James had placed in her. She knew she would never fully succeed, knew that she would fall short in 1,000 ways, but she also knew that the effort itself was what mattered, the trying, the direction. In one of the last letters she wrote to James, just a few weeks before her death, Margaret reflected on the journey they had taken together. "I have been thinking about that day in the hospital," she wrote. "The day you came down the stairs with the crate of supplies, and I said those terrible words to you. I have thought about that day more than any other in my life. It is the day I am most ashamed of, and yet it is also the day my real life began. Because it was the day I started to understand how wrong I had been, and the day I began to learn what was right. You could have responded to my hatred with hatred. No one would have blamed you. I had given you every reason to despise me, but instead you responded with kindness. You returned that photograph to me like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was simply what one human being does for another. And in that moment, you showed me what humanity is supposed to look like. I know that I can never repay what you gave me that day. I can never undo the words I said or the beliefs I held. But I have tried, James. For more than 40 years, I have tried to be the person you showed me I could be. I have tried to treat every person I meet with the dignity and respect that you modeled for me. I have tried to teach others what you taught me, that hatred is a poison and compassion is the only cure. I do not know if I have succeeded. I do not know if my small efforts have made any difference in this vast and troubled world, but I know that I am not the same person who spat at you in that basement. I know that I have moved in the right direction, and I know that you are the reason why. Thank you, James. Thank you for your kindness, your patience, your faith. Thank you for saving my life. I will see you again someday, and when I do, I hope you will be proud of what I have become." James read this letter many times after Margaret's death. He read it when he missed her, when he needed inspiration, when he wanted to remember why he had chosen the path he had chosen. He read it to his grandchildren as they grew up, hoping to instill in them the same values that had guided him. And he thought about her words on his own last day, as he lay in the hospital bed with Dorothy beside him, preparing to take his final journey. He had been proud of her. He had been so proud. Not because she was perfect, not because she had erased all the wrongs of her past, but because she had tried, because she had changed direction, because she had shown what was possible when someone chooses to open their heart instead of closing it. The world is full of hatred. It always has been, and perhaps it always will be. People will always find reasons to fear those who are different from them, to dehumanize those they do not understand, to perpetrate cruelty in the name of ideology or tribe or fear. This is the darkness in the human soul, the capacity for evil that has produced so much suffering throughout history. But the world is also full of the opposite. It is full of people who choose compassion over cruelty, who reach out across divides that seem unbridgeable, who respond to hatred with love. It is full of people who change, who grow, who learn to see the humanity in those they once despised. It is full of small acts of kindness that seem insignificant in the moment, but that ripple outward in ways that can never be fully measured. James Washington and Margaretha Hoffman were two such people. Their story is not the story of the war, not the story of the great battles and leaders and decisions that shaped the course of history. It is a small story, a personal story, one among millions that unfolded during those terrible years. But it is a story that matters because it shows us something essential about who we are and who we can become. It shows us that hatred can be unlearned. It shows us that enemies can become friends. It shows us that the direction we are moving in matters more than where we have been. It shows us that there is always hope, even in the darkest of times, because there will always be people who choose the light. That is the legacy of James Washington, the medic who returned a photograph. That is the legacy of Margareta Hoffman, the nurse who found the courage to change. May we all aspire to such a journey. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.